Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I have the pleasure of presenting this interview with Seb Henbest, who's the Global Head of Climate Transition and Global Sustainability for HSBC. Seb? Just grab this one. Unless you want a glass of water, in which case you can stay close to that. Seb, well, first of all, welcome. Thank you for being here. And so, Global Head of Climate Transition and Global Sustainability, a bit of a mouthful. Can you just sort of walk us through what that means, specifically at a bank?
Sure. First of all, the second bit's not my title. There is a Chief Sustainability Officer, so I work with her and the other senior management on climate transition in particular. And the first thing I'd say is I'm not a banker. I'm an energy economist. And don't ask
You're
me,
a banker now.
Oh, I'm a banker now, I suppose, indirectly. But I'm an energy economist, and my function, what I do, is new. The division around me is new, and I think that the sustainability and the way the bank is thinking about sustainability has been re-energised for re-engineering it around climate as the primary sort of lens in which we're seeing sustainability. And that's new. You know, ESG is a broad church, lots of important issues, but climate is a very particular techno-economic challenge. And my role sits sort of very fair and square in trying to work out solutions for the bank around climate. And the bank is doing a huge amount of stuff. It's got to coordinate internally across geography and different scales of banking, from the largest clients to the smallest clients.
This is about the portfolio of the bank.
Absolutely.
As opposed to its operations.
Absolutely. So a bank has essentially scope 3 emissions, right? It's got the emissions of its customers, and we can create a metric called financed emissions, which is the money the bank provides versus the emissions that the customers have. Yep. And that's the number that we've got to get to zero to be a net zero bank, and that's our primary objective. It's the fourth pillar of the company's overall business strategy, is be a net zero bank. So those financed emissions, we've got to get to zero. We've got 2 levers to do that. We can either reallocate the capital, or we can try and support clients on their transition journey. The former doesn't do much for the climate, but makes us look good. The latter maybe can help us solve this problem. And the breadth of HSBC from east to west in the world economy, and from largest to smallest, gives it a very particular position. And the targets that we set ourselves are therefore targets that are really broad and global. And the bank is super busy in places like Asia, and of course in China through the Shanghai Banking Corporation, and of course in the Middle East. And this is parts of the world where this fight's going to be won or lost, right? So when we're setting targets for ourselves, and the role I'm playing to help the bank achieve those targets, these are pretty meaningful commitments that actually point at the really carbon-intensive bits of the world economy.
So is there more of a push from the bank to the clients to engage in the energy transition, or is there more of a pull from the clients asking the bank to help them along? So how do you see that dynamic?
There's a bit of both, but right now our primary focus is to understand what our clients are doing and work out ways to support them. They come to us with requests, absolutely. But if you look across the world, there are some parts of the world where companies are far ahead on this and moving very quickly, and we've got to look at those clients, look at their plans and say, okay, how can we accelerate that? How can we help? And on the other end of the spectrum, there are clients who are just starting out. They may not have very sophisticated plans. They may not have targets. They have the odd ad hoc project. This is hardly a transition plan. Well, then we've got to go to them with a different question and a different set of objectives. How can we move them forward? How can we make progress? At some point in the future, we're going to have to make some hard calls on whether our clients are on track or not. Right now, we're looking and saying, how can we help them get on track? So really, we're reaching out to them. At the moment, we're doing a set of client transition plan assessments focused on OECD coal companies. The bank earlier this year put out a policy, a thermal coal policy, to say the bank would be out of coal by 2030 in OECD and 2040 in non-OECD, and that it would assess client transition plans to check what's going on with them to try and achieve that. So we're doing that now, and that means actually creating a framework to do an assessment of where a client is at, right? And an assessment, from our perspective, has a certain set of criteria that need to be met. We want to know whether the customer is reporting its emissions. Does it know its emissions? If it doesn't know it, it can't manage it, right? So we need disclosures here. We need targets, so we need some objective, long-term targets, ideally interim targets, targets that look both at the scopes of emissions, ideally 1 to 3, all greenhouse gases. Is it complete or is it partial? Plans to meet those targets. Are they lining up initiatives around where their emissions are and really targeting that with quantitative, deep thinking about how they're actually going to transition as a business, and then are they putting that into action? What are they doing to make those plans come to life? And each client, we go client by client, look at that, come to an assessment of where they are on their journey to work out how we can move them forward. And we really hope right now that the majority of our clients can go on this journey with us, and then we're achieving the goal of being, the leading bank in the transition, which sounds great, but actually for a bank like HSBC is hugely challenging, but potentially, a really significant part of what we can do to get there.
That basically sounds like an awful lot of work, and very, very complicated. And so I wonder how far along sort of are you with sort of some big clients? Actually, I don't know whether it's easier for a big client or a small client. You can imagine different challenges for both small companies and large companies. But if you took a big European coal firm, say, so you don't have to name one, but how far along that path that you sketched out have you got?
Yeah. So right now we are collecting and assessing the first tranche of transition plans. And when I say collect a transition plan, these things often don't exist. They're not a document you can pick up. Sometimes they are. Most of the time, companies have strategies with transition elements, and we've got to pick all that apart. So there is a lot of work to do that. So right now, we're collecting and assessing. This is an annual process and may get triggered by investment proposals as well around particular clients. We're looking at coal primarily, thermal coal primarily, and our broader power and utilities clients and oil and gas. So we set targets for these sectors. We've set a target of 75% reduction in finance emissions intensity for power and utilities clients by 2030. And we've set a target for our oil and gas customers of a 34% reduction in absolute emissions, financed emissions is the way we have to measure it, by 2030 as well. So we've got targets, and now we have to do the assessment to see who's lined up with that and who's not, and move them forward. There's another
Are there intermediate targets before 2030? Like in 2 years' time, they ought to be there, and in 5 years' time?
No, there's not. And the reason for that is we want to give ourselves some time to actually finance a transition here. We start to set targets that are very tight immediately. We start to cut off our opportunities to make it the impact that we want to make. And we end up being forced to just exit, and then we haven't achieved the goal here. And those clients are still doing what they were doing, and no one's the better. So we do have to think, for coal, there are some interims. There's overall, I think, from memory, it's 25% reduction by 2025, 50% by 2030 for thermal coal, but that's a particular one. There's another 7 sector targets coming. So that's on heavy industry, automotive and transport, and there'll be more after that on residential buildings, commercial buildings, agriculture. So as we do our work to figure out our Scope 3 emissions, and for a bank, Scope 3 emissions are a microcosm of the whole economy. Yeah. This is a really challenging thing to try and calculate. There are no established methodologies. There's a lot of financial institutions coming together right now to try and establish those methodologies, so there are industry standards around that. But we have to measure our own baselines so we can manage our own financed emissions, set the targets, and that is the first step for us. Our full transition plan as HSBC is due to come out in 2023, putting not just our client transition plan engagements, but the policy work that we're doing. There's a new energy policy that's due out this year, a new forestry policy due out this year, all aligned with these net zero objectives. And ultimately, we've got to wire the bank from front to back. And this is the thing that I think is important to understand, is the bank does things in a certain way. It's a very profitable and successful enterprise. We have to make sure that the risk appetite and the capital allocation lines up with the opportunities that our frontline are identifying and trying to grasp. And if we can get that lined up front to back, the capital will flow into the low carbon stuff we need it to flow into, and away from the high carbon stuff. And we've actually got the possibility of playing a really important role in the story.
So, I mean, before doing the current job, I was environment correspondent for about 18 months, which was a fascinating beat. Actually, it was the best job on the paper because you basically got to write about anything because the environment touches on every facet of the human condition. But one of the stories I did, one of the last stories I did actually, was about climate resilience and companies basically not getting their act together when it comes to preparing for the physical risks associated with climate change. And the thing that came up there repeatedly in my conversations with representatives of big business was that they didn't actually even have an incentive to start looking at their exposures to this sort of risk. Because once they started looking and they discovered that these were material, as they would almost inevitably be, they would need to disclose them. And if they disclosed them, they would be completely walloped by the stock market and so you have this huge first mover disadvantage. So without a government mandate to say everybody needs to disclose, setting a level playing field that way from the top down, there wasn't much of an incentive for any one company in any one sector to actually do anything because they would be punished as opposed to rewarded. So how does, is HSBC worried about a similar sort of, reaction from the market and a backlash from shareholders, which you're sort of seeing in some places against, broader ESG issues in the past year or so?
So the first thing I'd say is that I think the road to net zero is paved by government policy intervention. The market is a very powerful tool for the allocation of value, but the rate of change required to get to zero in a 1.5 degree carbon budget is dramatic, and that's not going to just magically emerge, especially for sectors where the technology and the pathways are still in their infancy, and there's a few of those. So government plays a really critical role. The thing that's changed is this idea of net zero. This didn't exist a few years ago. And the UK was the first government to put a net zero target in place, and it precipitated this flood of activity. If you look around the world, about 90% of world emissions are now covered by some sort of net zero target, whether it's legislated or in discussion. This is everywhere now, and the corporate world is following suit. Yeah. Net zero changes the narrative in a really important way, and it changes it because you go from arguing about who ought to go first, where the moral obligation lies in climate change, who should pay the cost of doing so, to a question of how do we get to zero at least cost in the most efficient way. And as that discussion has changed, a financial institution like HSBC, and if you look more broadly across banks, they're all doing versions of this. We can now make that punt, right? We can now go, the timing's right, the targets are emerging, the government intent is there, we've got to get to zero. There's no free riders in this situation because everyone's got to get to zero. You can't get to zero with some sectors not having done anything. So we can look across our entire portfolio and say, hey, everything's got to transition. How do we do it in a way that's gradual, that enables us as a business to do good business, enables our clients to do good business? And that's the discussion we're having now. So yes, there are some risks of going out, putting our neck out, going out in front in this way. We're working with the industry to try and mitigate those first mover disadvantages, but we also have to capture the first mover advantages of this, which is to get on with it and not be a bank that's sitting recalcitrant waiting for someone else to do it, because that A, ain't going to solve the problem, and B, is a bad business strategy at this point in time.
So, I mean, in the medium term, that sounds perfectly plausible, but sort of in the short term, you had this news in the past few weeks even that some of the big American banks are pulling out of Mark Carney's post-COP Edinburgh initiative for fear of a political backlash in America, which is obviously massively polarized on this issue. You have Texas blacklisting BlackRock, yeah, and so on. So is that just a sort of a problem which is specific to America and its polarized political climate that's less of an issue in Asia, in Europe, in other places that HSBC is doing business, or is this is this something that could derail the transition, at least in the short term, everywhere?
It's a great question. So I don't think it's going to derail the transition ultimately. There's too much corporate activity moving in this direction. Rates of change will matter. Are we going to do it fast enough? Great question. I mean, if everything lines up, this is one of the hardest problems civilization has ever had to face and manage. Are we, even with our best efforts, going to get there? Gee, I hope so, but so I'm not sure that any one barrier is going to be, the end of this game. I do think that where in parts of the world where climate is heavily politicised, this can happen. In this country, it's far less politicised, and so it feels like that's something that goes on elsewhere. But I'm from Australia, and it's been heavily politicised in Australia, of course, for a decade or more. So yeah, there are these sorts of headwinds. The importance of something like the GFANZ collection of companies is that it's the finance industry coming together to solve really difficult problems that alone it has first mover risks. So together, everyone can move and actually make progress. So it's a really effective mechanism. Now, is there danger of overreach? Yeah, we've got to be careful. It's got to be an orderly transition. We can't be blindly pushing towards objectives that are economically destructive, because that's not how we're going to do this. There's going to be pushback against that. So the burden is on us to do this carefully and do it sensibly, but to do it consistently and with targets and objectives that are relatively non-negotiable here. We've got a bit of wiggle room, but ultimately not much carbon budget and not many years to work with. So we're full steam ahead about now.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sure we could keep on talking about this. It is an endless subject. So thank you very much, Seb. Thank you for listening. And on to the next session. Is that right?